Hello, everyone. You're listening to For Those We Lost. I'm your host, Jennifer Sullivan. Thank you for being here. If you've lost a loved one to COVID and would like to share your story on the show, please send me an email. My email address is forthosewelostpodcast@gmail.com. Or you can go to the website forthosewelostpodcast.com and click on the contact button, and you can reach me that way as well. In this show, people share their stories of losing a loved one to COVID. Every story you hear in this show is full of heartbreak, grief, loss, and frustration, but they are also full of love and hope. We talk about how we are coping, we talk about how to keep the memory of our loved ones alive, and how isolating our grief is as the world wants to move on. You'll hear us talk a little bit about the vaccine and politics, and you may not agree, but I hope you'll keep listening because each person who shares their story on this show has experienced profound grief over the loss of a loved one. And that's something we will all experience. We all love someone, we will all lose someone we love, and we will all grieve. These are the stories of those we lost to COVID. Thanks for being here with me. I've got a really great show coming up for you today. In this episode, I'll be talking with Lisa in Nashville. Lisa lived in New York City on and off for over 10 years to be near her significant other, Ben. Ben was an MTA train conductor in New York City for 22 years, and he passed away of COVID on April 29th, 2020. Just a day after his birthday. As Lisa tells their story, you understand their relationship, why she was in Nashville, and how their devotion to the Jewish faith influenced the decisions they both made and how Lisa is working through Ben's loss. We recorded this episode on December 2nd, 2021. Lisa tells Ben's story so beautifully. How he was an active member of his Brooklyn community, his Jewish community, and the world of train, memorabilia, and knowledge. I Googled Ben, just like Lisa did, and found a lot of online articles about him. I've included a few of them in the show notes so that you can learn more about Ben, his beloved city, and his life. One of the websites I found memorializes many MTA workers in New York City who have died of COVID-19. The memorial includes a poem called Travels Far by Tracy K. Smith, and I'm going to read it. It goes like this. What you gave, brief tokens of regard, soft words uttered, barely heard, the smile glimpsed from a passing car, through stations and years, through the vain chambers of a stranger's heart, what you gave travels far. I'm grateful to Lisa for reaching out to me and telling the story of Ben so that his memory also travels far. And now I'd like to welcome Lisa to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Yeah, I really am glad that you reached out to me and that we were able to set up this time to talk today. I like to start at the beginning of the pandemic back in March of 2020. And because most everything with you happened then, I think that's a good place to start. One thing you did bring up is that you lived in New York City.
Yes.
And you went home to Nashville in the fall or early winter part of 2019. Can you talk about that and why?
Okay. So I lived in New York on and off between 2009 and 2019. I met Ben at a synagogue in Brooklyn in 2009. And even though I was just subletting, I moved to New York permanently to be with him. So with 2019, my dad got sick. He got a UTI and fell, and he had to go into the hospital and rehab. I moved back to Nashville in December 2019 to take care of him.
Hmm.
The last time I was in New York was the last week of February in 2020. I stayed in a hotel in Borough Park, Brooklyn, a very Jewish neighborhood where there is a kosher hotel where Ben really wanted me to stay. Ben and I got into an argument over the phone when I was in New York, and so we ended up not meeting. But I spent the weekend in Borough Park over that 3-day period, and also several hours in a private subscription library in Manhattan, where I'm a member. After getting home, in um, I went to a large gathering and where I met my niece, and then I worked the election polls in early March.
Mm.
After getting back, Ben and I made up, but I also learned that the neighborhood where I had been spending a lot of time had 100 cases of coronavirus. And the library where I'd spent several hours had a member who had just been diagnosed with a virus.
Oh, wow.
And, you know, I don't like to think that I could have unwittingly been a vector. I mean, I could have infected my niece who was a bride to be. Who knows what may have happened, but Ben and I made up and I would hear him coughing over the phone. Um, and he was off work for a bit, and he was the first person who was telling me about the coronavirus. There was a there was a diagnosis in Westchester County, which is north of New York City. And in March of 2020, a friend of mine who lived in Upper Manhattan, where I lived many years, was diagnosed with COVID. They weren't calling it COVID at that point. They were still calling it coronavirus. And then a second friend in the neighborhood um, was also diagnosed. Um, and then more and more celebrities were either dying or being diagnosed with the virus.
Yeah.
I was getting nervous about this. Ben was someone who's extremely risk averse. I mean, you have to understand, he would not get on a plane. He didn't wear scarves because they were a choking hazard. He didn't want us to host people um, in our home after we married because someone might trip and sue us. So, those kinds of things. He was really obsessed with his money being FDIC insured, just quirks like that.
Hmm.
I felt at least secure in the fact that he wouldn't take stupid risks.
Hmm. And can you talk for a few minutes about him and his place in the community? And for people who don't know more about his particular Jewish religion, like his beliefs and faith.
Okay, so Ben was an Orthodox Jew, and when we first met, I was going through the process of conversion to Judaism. Ben was a subway conductor for the New York MTA. He was also a shop steward in his union, but he was also really interested in running for city council when he retired, which would be around now if he had lived.
Hmm.
He had been a volunteer police officer for 28 years. He
Wow.
belonged to many civic organizations. He was a treasurer for his police precinct. He had many low-level political jobs.
So he was active in the community, you told me that he was one of only 2 MTA operators who were part of it.
Who were Orthodox Jews,
Mhm.
yes. And that other person, joined the MTA, went to his yeshiva, and which is a religious school. So he joined because Ben told him what a great job it was. One thing to understand about Ben is that he was a walking encyclopedia of trains. He wrote a book on subways. He was known in the rail fan community, which is what they call people who follow trains, who are interested in trains and train infrastructure. He was a walking encyclopedia of anything related to trains, subways, or barges.
Wow.
He was a respected person in his community. And he was a hero twice. A couple of years ago, he evacuated a train when a crazy passenger spilled gas in his subway car. And before that, he noticed something dangerous on the subway's third rail, um, which could have which could have been lethal if anyone had come in contact with it. It's not Subways 101, so it's hard to explain, but
Mhm.
because his level of acumen, he was able to spot something that not every employee would have been able to.
Yeah. And so you and he dated for 10 years.
Yeah, there was a 7-month period in 2018 where I had broken up with him, but we got back together.
Mhm. And you had a small circle of friends while you lived there, and then you were working on converting to Judaism. And so, why don't you go to March of 2020 or April of 2020 and what was going on and how you you decided not to go back to New York City because Ben told you it was unsafe.
Right. We had made up, and he was mad because I didn't want to drop everything and go to an event that he told me about at the last minute. So I was about to book another flight, which is extremely cheap at that point, but he said, "No, he was the very first person who was talking to me about the coronavirus, and he said, "Don't do this right now. We're
Yeah.
watching this." And we were getting concerned because even though a lot of people were following the clusters around that time, I think it was sometime in March when the first coronavirus fatality took place in Nashville, where I had returned to and where I'm still living. It was at the point where not everybody was told to wear a mask, but people were told don't go out unless you have to. My dad, even though he wasn't driving again yet, he really wanted to go out shopping. And this is the exact person who would be at risk if he caught the virus.
Mhm.
Ben was extremely afraid for his elderly parents. Um, he was worried about he was worried about my dad, but also I had a tracheotomy when I was young, and I was born with an abnormally small windpipe. And every time I would get the flu, I would have to go to the ER because I'd have trouble swallowing and breathing.
Oh.
I was terrified of what would happen if I actually got COVID.
Mhm.
And he was kind of haranguing me every time we were talking on the phone in March of 2020. He's saying, "Ah, yeah, your father's an idiot, blah, blah, blah." I already knew to be terrified. I didn't need him at compounding everything.
Yeah.
And it would get to the point he would call me frequently at night. Um, but I would end up just kind of ending the conversation early because he was just upsetting me too much. I didn't feel like it served a constructive purpose.
Mhm.
I knew what he needed to do. I was doing everything I could, ordering all the food in, but my dad insisted on going out. And it was just, and Ben was not helping. So, as I said, at some point, he had been coughing, and then I guess I wasn't hearing it as much, but he went back to work. And he could have had sort of an out because, again, when he had evacuated the train, he was able to get a diagnosis for PTSD and he had a desk job. But at that time, so many of his coworkers were getting sick that he was badly needed.
Yeah.
And we would talk about it. He would say that there's hardly anybody on the train. He told his friend that he felt like a ghost because, I mean, he was just like alone on the train. And I was getting nervous in late March because about 30 something MTA workers were dying. But it's not that I thought Ben was invincible, but I at least had that security of knowing that he was very risk averse.
Yeah.
So we would talk, and the Passover, Pesach was coming up. And one thing to understand about that is that the first 2 days and the last 2 days of the holiday, as well as on the Jewish Sabbath, Orthodox Jews do not use a telephone, they don't use the internet. So I knew that at that time that, if I wanted to wish him a happy holiday, I would need to do it beforehand.
Yeah.
So around that time, it was getting close to that time. He was not calling as much, but I was a little bit relieved because he was just compounding my anxiety so much that I didn't really force it. So finally I called him to wish him a happy holiday. I didn't hear back from him. But one thing he would always do whenever I called, he would immediately call back. I learned not even to leave a phone message because he wouldn't listen. He would just immediately call back as soon as he was home. And I was not hearing from him from an unusual period over an unusual period of time. So, it was the holiday, the first 2 days of the holiday. I later found out that he went to the ER on the first day of the holiday. But there are some intermediate days during Passover where you can use the internet, you can use the phone.
Mm-hmm.
And I called him again and he wasn't responding. So either April 5th or April 6th, I'd left a voicemail for him. No response, but I called him and finally I got him again. And he was like, I don't feel like talking now. And he didn't sound sick, he just sounded like he was in this foul mood. And I said, well, can I have a kiss? And he said, mwah, which is what he always did. That's kind of how we said goodbye or whatever. So, I said, love you, and, he wished me a happy Pesach, got off the phone. So like I just said, a couple of days later, unbeknownst to me, he went to the ER.
Mm-hmm.
When we got to approaching the 7th day of the holiday, which again would be a time where you didn't get on the internet, you didn't use the phone, I wasn't hearing from him, but I thought we were cool. And I was sort of relieved a little bit to not have to deal with this fear mongering or whatever. That's the wrong word, but it was getting to me.
Yeah.
So, 7th day of the holiday, I don't hear from him. I hadn't heard from him. And because I'm not Jewish yet, I mean, there's no reason I couldn't get on the internet, but I was working toward that. So I really don't do that. But I was getting just nervous. I was thinking about him. I'd even gotten an Ancestry.com subscription so where I could go through high school annuals, and I was going through his old high school looking for his picture.
Mhm.
But I hadn't called him again. I hadn't heard from him. So it was a couple of hours after the seventh day of Passover had begun. And I did something that I had done periodically. I Googled him. Ben had always called me up and asked me because he didn't have internet at home, another of his weird quirks. And he would ask me to get up and turn on the computer, look something online for him.
Mhm.
And sometimes he would be mentioned in a story or whatnot. So I have a background in PR, so I was planning on helping him in his campaign when he ran for public office, so I was used to Googling him.
Yeah.
So I Googled him, and there was a headline. It wasn't a news story at that point, but his union website put up a post saying that Ben had coronavirus. He was in Maimonides Medical Center in Brooklyn fighting for his life, and he needed plasma from people someone who had survived the virus.
Mhm.
That's called convalescent plasma.
Yeah.
And at that stage, that was one of the few options available. And doctors had recommended convalescent plasma for him. The hospital didn't do a really good job of explaining how everything worked. It sounded like you just needed one person to donate, but you couldn't direct donate convalescent plasma. I found out later that the way it worked is that convalescent plasma was put into a general pool at the hospital blood bank, and Ben was on a waiting list.
Mm.
Now, Maimonides, as it turned out, was at the epicenter of the coronavirus outbreak.
Yeah.
I told you before there had been 100 people diagnosed in early March in Borough Park, where I'd been staying in this hotel.
Mhm.
And it's also a couple of blocks from the hospital where he was. I learned later that he'd been in the hospital 2 days and was receiving oxygen. His 88-year-old dad was bringing him food. I don't understand. I guess they weren't feeding him. Or, I mean, it was a Jewish hospital. He could have gotten kosher food, even for Passover. But apparently, that's how things were going.
Wow.
And I was the first thing I did. I panicked, and then I immediately got online and just kind of spread the word in my social networks.
Yeah.
And then I had seen a news story that they had seen some bodies being loaded into refrigerated trucks at Maimonides in a parking lot at Maimonides. And of course, I was thinking, so I knew exactly where Ben was going to end up if things didn't work out better for him.
Mhm.
So, I mean, here I was. He was fighting for his life. He never ever told me, I think I have COVID or I have COVID.
Yeah.
I'd heard him coughing, and a couple of weeks after that, Ben had told me that he thought he may have had the virus and gotten better. He wouldn't have gone back to work if he thought he was really at risk.
Mhm.
That wasn't the kind of person he was. But I didn't know how to contact Ben's parents. They didn't have internet. And I was just freaking out, freezing. I got on all the Facebook groups that I belong to that are related to PR and marketing. I told everybody, this is a situation. I'm freaking out. Please give me some advice. So somebody referred me to Survivor Corps, which is, I think, primarily for people who are recovering from coronavirus, but they had on the site a database of people who were either potential donors, people who'd recovered from COVID, and were potential convalescent plasma donors. And then people who needed it, not only could they post on the Facebook group site, but there's actually a database somewhere therein. So luckily, I think the best decision I made was to just tell people, I'm freaking out, I'm not thinking straight. And, very quickly I became sleep deprived. So
Yeah.
I don't know how effective I really was during this period, but I was doing what I could think to do.
Yeah.
I was, and I was also, because of the state I was in, I was screwing up right and left. I mean, I emailed all the synagogues that Ben went to, and with two of them, I had actually put the email in the outbox, but it never got transmitted.
Oh.
And I was telling everybody, all my neighbors that I would run into, what was going on. And I would think of anybody with a New York connection. And I emailed them and asked them to spread the word about him needing convalescent plasma. I mean, I was emailing my rabbi, the wife of a rabbi who'd moved away. Everybody, my neighbors. I mean, my neighbor from New York asked me how am I doing. I did not reply fine. I basically spilled my guts, told her what was going on.
Yeah.
So another thing I did, as things were going on, I was making decisions that would have really made Ben angry. He had asked me not to go around telling people that I was going out with him because I wasn't Jewish. We had a circle of friends who knew, but a lot of people in Brooklyn didn't have a clue. And I went so far as to email the rabbi of Ben's estranged sister who hadn't talked to him in 25 years. I knew that Ben knew one of the rabbis at her synagogue, and I said, this is my boyfriend, he's the brother of so-and-so in your congregation. Please daven for him, which means pray for him, and please spread the word about him needing convalescent plasma. And at that point, I was just like, okay, everybody's just going to have to understand.
Yeah.
If Ben breaks up with me, he breaks up with me, but I had to feel that I had really done everything I knew to help him. And if the sister got mad, if his parents got mad, I was ready. I was ready for the shit to hit the fan.
Yeah.
So I was also pitching stories to local news outlets. One of them was the Daily News. And I just told the story about him. And I had a list of all of Ben's accomplishments that I was planning to use to set up a website when he ran for city council in a few years. And instead of using that for his campaign, I was using it to pitch a story about him needing convalescent plasma in order to try and save his life.
Yeah.
So this went on for 6 days, and so there is a belief, even among Orthodox Jews, that you can violate the Sabbath or a holiday to save a life, and that's what I was doing. When I first learned that Ben was fighting for his life and needed the plasma, it was a holiday, and a lot of people I knew would help were not there to read it online, wouldn't know about it for a couple of days. So I was pumping serious adrenaline, just doing what I could. In a normal situation, if somebody needed like an organ or plasma in a pre-pandemic time frame, you'd set up a blood drive.
Yeah.
You'd hold a live event, but no one was going out. Everything, the internet seemed to be like everybody's lifeline.
Yes.
So I was doing what I could from afar. And sometimes my efforts were kind of scattershot, but I mean, that's what I was doing. And I was telling everybody I'm his girlfriend. And some people were saying, huh? But, I told him, I was at this point spilling my guts about everything, about him going out with a non-Jew, and, whatever happened, happened.
Mm-hmm.
This went on for 6 days, as I said. I couldn't get hold of his parents. And I think because I was freaking out, I realized in retrospect that it was easier than I thought it was. But I did find somebody, a friend of his, um, who had their number, and I got in touch with his dad. It turned out that by that time, Ben received plasma. And I think it had been a couple of weeks that he'd been on the ventilator.
Mm.
He had been. So after 2 days of being in the ER receiving oxygen, he'd taken a turn for the worse. And he was intubated at that point. There was a 6-day period where, the pressure was off. I had done everything I could. And the only thing you could do is pray for him. But I realized, like after the fact, that a lot of people, when they passed the story along, they were just saying, we'll pray for him, but they weren't sharing the story about him needing plasma. And I should back up and say he was getting covered in the news, like by local TV stations, but they didn't mention the contact number they needed for the hospital blood bank. They didn't say what hospital he was at. And whenever I saw a screw, I was monitoring the media. And whenever someone screwed up, I would do what I could to just kind of get the facts across.
Yeah.
So to just do what I could to just put myself in touch with people who would pass along the information. And I just kept doing it until I knew for sure he had received the plasma.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, I was pretty burnt out. But I would share stories about him on the internet. And the information that was coming about online came from local Brooklyn politicians who knew Ben. So it's like these political figures knew more about the person I wanted to spend my life with than I did.
Yeah.
So I got hold of Ben's dad, and I told him, what was going on. I told him, everything that happened, that people like all over, like, even though there are a lot of people in Brooklyn who were helping more than others, there were also people who never met Ben, like my second cousin in Michigan, who was really getting it out and letting it go viral.
Mm-hmm.
No pun intended, but I'm fine with it in that. I'm fine with saying viral in that context.
Yeah.
So I talked to him, and I asked him, just, please keep me updated. And he said, do you know what a Hemira is in Hebrew? And I said, no. But he said, it means my word. I'll give you my word that I'll let you, that I will call you with good news, he said.
Mm-hmm.
So, that was, I believe, April the 21st.
Mm-hmm.
It does kind of blur a bit sometimes.
It does. Oh, I know that. Yes.
And so April 27th was Ben's birthday. It was his 58th birthday. And I called his dad again, because I knew it was going to be a hard day. He had to, he actually, that conversation did not last as long. He said he had to do something. So I let him go, but I was glad that I called him. So the next day, which was April 28th, in the evening, I get a Facebook PM from two different people simultaneously. One of them was a friend of Ben's that I'd been, messaging, that I didn't know before all this happened. And the other was from my ex roommate, in Manhattan who didn't really see eye to eye with Ben. And I hadn't heard from her in several years. She was calling me to give condolences,
Oh.
assuming I already heard the news.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the local politicians were spreading the word that Ben had passed away. So, I mean, I just told everybody. I wasn't making too many phone calls at that point, but I mean, it was just like, what do you do with that?
Yeah.
And the next day, there was a local New York One reporter who asked to interview me and I felt like at that point, people needed to know about Ben. They
Mm-hmm.
needed to know. I mean, he didn't have underlying conditions. He was healthy. He was a speed walker. He once, on one Passover, he walked 6 hours from Brooklyn to Upper Manhattan to see me. We once walked from the Bronx to Yonkers, New York together. Everything was planned for what he was going to do when he retired.
Yeah.
And a reporter from the Daily News who I communicated with about him needing plasma, I told her again when he passed away. So I was like, the next day, communicating with the press, doing something I didn't feel like doing, but it was so time sensitive what I was doing.
Yeah.
And I was waiting to hear from Ben's parents.
Mm-hmm.
And so I found out that Ben had passed away in the afternoon of April the 28th. And a lot of people, funeral homes were backed up, but in Orthodox Judaism, you're buried the next day.
Mm-hmm.
I was very glad to find out that he was able to be buried the next day. I think it helped that he had that there was a plot, so he's like buried uh, a couple of headstones down from the great grandfather he's named after.
Oh.
So I was glad about that, but still, you hear about someone you love being buried before you even know about it.
Mm-hmm.
And another thing people do is they sit Shiva, which is a 7-day mourning period. Normally, what happens is they go to the mourner's home,
Mm-hmm.
and they bring food. But the only thing you could really do is like call his parents. And that someone had offered to do a Zoom Shiva and set it up for them, but they didn't have internet, and they politely declined that, as I found.
Yeah.
So I called his dad, and he didn't really I mean, he was nice to me, but he didn't seem to remember that he'd promised to call me. So that's kind of how it was. And, we weren't married, so there's not like and I wasn't Jewish yet. So there's not like a specific thing I could do to like
Yeah.
move.
Yeah.
And of course, because everything was in lockdown, people were not supposed to be going out. The one person who did come to bring me food is a good friend of mine, who is Jewish. And so she came over the day after I guess it would be 2 days after Ben died. And, out of caution, I mean, we couldn't like hug or anything. The only thing that we could do is I would open the door, and the only thing we could do is just stand there and stare at each other's eyes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, me, of course, even if he weren't buried the next day, I mean, I was like way too far away. I didn't feel like I knew. I did ask, you know, his dad if he ever regained consciousness, and he didn't. I did not feel comfortable asking like this 88-year-old man he just lost his only son, questions about, other details. So a lot of people, I belong to a COVID loss support group, and we're talking about different details like their loved ones' oxygen levels, and often I listen to them and I think, I wish I did know Ben's oxygen levels. I wish I could read his medical records, even though a lot of people, for very understandable reasons, are choosing not to look at their loved ones' medical reports. I wish I had that option. I mean,
Yeah.
I couldn't have any contact with him. The only way I knew to advocate for him is to do what I was doing, just get the word out about his accomplishments to make sure everyone knew it.
Yeah.
And most of that time after that was a blur.
Hmm.
And I wanted to talk about, I had a friend named Emily who lived in Brooklyn. And during this time, we always PM'd on Facebook every Wednesday. When I lived in Brooklyn, we saw each other twice a week. We belonged to a women writers workshop together. And after Ben passed, I mean, we would we would chat online every Wednesday. I tried not to monopolize the conversation, but we were talking a lot about Ben
Yeah.
and all the stuff that was going on. So in Thanksgiving of 2020, I suddenly wasn't hearing from her. And I found out later that she had been falling and had been showing signs of aphasia. And her boyfriend called an ambulance when she fell and couldn't get up. And Ben and Emily was in a hospital in Brooklyn, not the same one as Ben, but she was having tests, and at some point she got COVID in the hospital.
Mm.
And she suddenly, I mean, it was determined that she had a brain tumor. I mean, I don't want to say, I mean, her prognosis was not great,
Yeah.
but she suddenly had a cardiac arrest in January 12th and died of COVID complications.
Oh.
And, just someone that you've been talking to about a loved one who died of COVID, and now they're dead from COVID,
Hmm.
makes me feel like very vulnerable, like anything is possible now.
Yeah. Yeah, you could lose anybody. And you're so far away from this whole situation and everything that happened with Ben and
Mhm.
him getting COVID and going in the hospital and learning so much from a distance. And then trying to do all of these things for him from a distance, even going so far as knowing that some of the stuff you're doing would make him potentially angry and that he might end your relationship.
Right. Anything was possible.
Yeah.
I should even back up and say there's at some point where there was a false report. I think there's a misunderstanding and he'd been confused with someone else. One of his friends had heard from one of her friends that he was off the ventilator and had been put on a respirator. And I was thinking at that point, okay, all right, shit's gonna hit the fan. And I was bracing myself for it, but I knew he was okay at that point.
Yeah.
But then we got devastated all over again when it turned out that that was incorrect. He never got off the ventilator. I got to a point where I just had to say everyone else has to understand. I
Mhm.
was doing what I knew I could do. I had to make decisions that I could live with.
Do you feel like wherever Ben's soul or consciousness or whatever you and he believe in, do you feel like he understands now?
He would have to understand. I mean, I will say this, and this is one way that I kinda deal with everything. Whenever it rains, I get into the back seat of my car and I talk to Bennett. And I cry a lot, and the more the rain pounds, the more cathartic it is. So, if he exists on any level, he's heard everything, and he knows, then I guess he would know everything that went on.
Yeah.
And I talked to his dad, and I explained the best I could what I did, when I did it, and why. And he understood when I talked to him.
Can I ask you about August of this year? Because you're still in Nashville
Yes.
and you're still helping to take care of your dad.
Yeah, and at this point, of course, with the pandemic, I'm a freelance writer, and I haven't been getting that much income, so I might as well be at my dad's home.
Yeah.
It's the safest place to be. I'm safe, he's safe, and I guess whatever support system there is, I mean, it exists there.
Yeah.
So, originally, when the anniversary of it, with his birthday. Ooh, I should emphasize he died a day after his birthday, so his birthday and his yard site, the anniversary of his death on the secular calendar are back to back.
Mm.
Um, so there was no way of going to visit his grave at that point. It was still we were hearing about Delta. It was just not. I was just really uncomfortable going. And when I called his dad, late March, early April 2021, they didn't have an unveiling planned. And so, what I decided to do is to do like an online, I contacted the New York Transit Museum, which he belonged to and supported financially. And I decided that in lieu of going to New York, I would sponsor a Zoom event in Ben's memory. And originally, they do have like online Zoom calls where you can do it with a group or as a party or whatever, and that's at cost. So I contacted them. I told them who it was for, reminded them who Ben was, and so I was thinking, okay, they're going to do this. Well, they contacted me. They offered to do it for free because they're affiliated with the MTA, the Metropolitan Transit Authority in New York. They had access to the MTA server and it was free. And I could I didn't have to limit it to 40 people which is normally the Zoom limit,
Mhm.
but up to 500 people could be accommodated on the Zoom call.
Wow.
So I gave like a brief talk and slideshow on Zoom on his birthday. So come August 2021, it was a point where I had postponed my flight to August, and just so happened that the COVID March to Remember was going to be taking place nationwide, but specifically to New York, over the Brooklyn Bridge. So I decided the march was on August 7th, which is the anniversary of the day Ben and I met in 2009.
Oh.
So I flew in April 6th, and I visited Ben's grave for the first time. The stone's still not up. But the next day, I did the march, and just being in solidarity with all those people and seeing people that I'd been Zooming with online support group Zoom calls for about a year, seeing them in person really helped.
Yeah.
Seeing my friend who's from Manhattan, who's a long haul COVID survivor, helped. And seeing other friends after the event helped. So I'm not going to get total closure until the pandemic is actually over. I'm doing the very best I know how to just kind of channel everything that I'm going through in a constructive way. But I don't think anybody who's lost anyone to COVID is going to have complete closure as long as a pandemic is going on and people are at risk.
Yeah.
It helped, once we were no longer in lockdown, that helped a little because the things that were keeping us safe and healthy were also making it more difficult to go through what we were doing. I mean, he died in April 2020. This was when everything was happening.
Right.
I would go on his union's website where I'd first learned about him being sick. And before I had that other contact from his friends, the only way I knew about what was going on with Ben is to visit his union website. And every day, every time I visited the website, there was an announcement that another MTA worker had died of COVID.
Oh, that had to be scary.
He was the 96th person, the 96th MTA worker to die of COVID. And there have been 173. And, I would say that I know that people who lost loved ones to non-COVID causes during the pandemic, during the early parts of the pandemic, are experiencing some of the things that we've gone through. I mean, you either can't go to a funeral or the funeral's been delayed. I mean, Ben didn't get the funeral he deserved.
Yeah.
But there are 3 different things we're dealing with, 3 different kinds of grief as far as I can see, me being an armchair therapist. There's death. I mean, I've lost my mother, my brother, the grandparents who raised me, close friends, to different things from car accidents to drug overdoses to dying suddenly at home. There's death, and there's sudden death, or whatever. Then there's pandemic era death, where you can't go to a public funeral, you can't be at the hospital. And then there are people who died of COVID, where there's just a host of unanswered questions. And because the pandemic is still going on, we're constantly reminded of the reason they're gone.
Yes.
And when we're being surrounded by people who wear their masks under their noses, if they're wearing masks at all, we're being constantly reminded for the reason why this is being perpetuated. And how long is that sustainable?
Yeah.
Who else is going to succumb to this? What else is going to happen? I have to make a decision every day. Do I want to watch the news? What is going to happen to me if I open up this link to this news story? And I worked in PR, and I had to be covering the media. My livelihood depended on me knowing what was going on with the world. But just for my mental health, to a certain extent, I have to shut it down.
Yeah, that's how you're coping and moving through your grief is just by cutting off some of the things that are triggering and make you anxious. I That's how I feel too.
Yeah. I mean, I actually had a falling out with a friend who's an anti-vaxxer, and it's not because we disagree on the vaccine, it's because he won't respect my right to not talk about the vaccine in a social setting. I mean, you know, he's mad because I got up and left a conversation twice. So it's like I've lost two people close to me to the virus, and then one person to the politics of the virus.
Mhm.
And it was like the neighbors were sort of like my lifeline
Mhm.
in the early stages. The only thing I could do to really have any kind of social interaction was to go out walking in my condominium complex. But now it's like I don't always want to socialize with neighbors.
Yeah.
Oh, and one of them actually exposed me to COVID in Thanksgiving 2020. He was a neighbor down the hall, got sick with COVID, and he was inviting a friend of mine that I see all the time into his house. And then long story, he let my dad into his apartment to use the bathroom when we were having repairs done.
Mm.
So, this neighbor, he has COPD. I know that he smoked. I mean, he's been he's gone outside on a stretcher more times than I can count.
Yeah.
When he to this day, he like talks to people in the hallway and gets up close to them without a mask. Ben is dead. Ben was healthy and he's dead, but this guy is walking around like nothing ever happened.
Yeah. That's one of the things that doesn't make sense to me either, is why some people die and some don't. It just it just doesn't make any sense. I
I
think these are the questions that we could ask.
what we have to under what I really try to impress on people is you don't know how your body is going to react to coronavirus until you actually have it. I
Yeah.
mean, this neighbor with COPD, he was in the hospital for weeks, and he's been in the hospital, I've lost count of how many times. There have been times where he had trouble breathing and he was calling out in the hallway for help. This has been over, a long period of time, way before the pandemic.
Mhm.
I don't know why this guy is walking around and Ben is underground.
Yeah. Yeah, those are the questions we'll never have the answers to.
Maybe we'll have some clues in the future, but
Yeah.
we have to work, we have to operate on the assumption that anything could happen if it gets into our body.
Mhm. So, Lisa, one last question I like to ask everybody is, what do you say to people who tell you COVID isn't real?
Hmm. I don't know if you want me saying that over the airwaves or not. Um, but it's like, where the hell have you been? Like, what do you think is going on? Everything. I know the media has its imperfections, but everything can't be explained away with, with the media exaggerating everything.
Mhm.
I mean, come on, you have to understand this. I'm sure everybody knows someone who's been affected by COVID. I have friends and family in 4 different states who have had COVID. One of them is a long hauler. At least one is a long hauler. One is a nurse who had severe economic repercussions to getting it. I think she was even trying to bring an oxygen tank to her workplace. But what what do they think is going to happen? What if you don't believe COVID is real, what do you believe?
Yeah. Yeah, I think for me, just even a couple months ago, I didn't really have anybody in my family or circle here where I live in Oregon who had COVID or died of COVID. And then just within the last few months, I have people that I know that are part of my life. I mean, some of them distant and years ago who I've learned have died of COVID or lost their mom to COVID. And I think at this point, I agree with you that even though it's tough to tell sometimes with the news what's true and what's not true, we are all at this point, we're all going to experience it if we haven't already. And it's going to be in our immediate circle. COVID will be there.
One thing I like to tell people is that, if you lose somebody to COVID, your need to talk about it, about the person you lost, will outlast other people's desire to hear about it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, there's the thing I could talk about my mom all day, every day. I feel like sometimes I say, "Hi, I'm Jennifer. My mom died of COVID." But yes, there is that fatigue amongst my family and other people that I know. They want me to move on, but I'm not ready.
We can only really move forward, but we have to feel that we've done what we can to remember these people that we've lost.
Hmm.
And I mean, I don't know if I don't feel confident in my ability to talk someone out of their stupidity. I mean, what do I do? Do I try to educate people about COVID? Or do I just try to protect my mental health and avoid the conversation?
Yeah, and I think that's probably the place where I go and probably what you're doing for you and taking care of yourself, your own healing and your own grieving process. And I like what you said about, because I said move on and you said move forward. And I like that. That's a good distinction.
Not an original idea. There is, I think her name is Nora McInerney. I know she gave a TED talk about that. But here's one thing that I do. I mean, I don't have a training manual for how to deal with grief or COVID loss, but this is sort of what I figured out. All right.
Hmm.
Every day I say address, however long it's been that your loved one died, address the elephant in the room and grieve for them, acknowledge that loss every day. But also do one thing that has no direct connection to him. And that way you're sort of moving forward. Maybe you're kind of moving back and forth. Maybe you're just kind of crawling like a crab, but you're moving somewhere. And like Ben was not into art. We went to exactly one art gallery during our 10.5 year relationship. I'm doing things that he just wasn't interested in.
Hmm.
And so something that has no connection to him. That's and of course I make full use of the mental health resources that are out there and my and support groups that are out there. I just try to just get back to things that made me tick before. So
Hmm.
I don't know exactly how I'm going to do everything, but it's been said that the way to learn, like my ballet teacher used to tell me, the way to learn a step is to teach it to other people.
Hmm.
So
Yeah,
that's what I've figured out so far.
I like that. I like that a lot. Thank you for taking the time today and talking to me about Ben.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you for everyone who's taking the time to watch this, to listen to this today.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate you taking the time to tell his story and your story. I think it's I was so glad that you reached out to me, in part because there's certain things I learn from every single person who I talk to. And the Jewish faith is something that I don't know a lot about. And I certainly don't know a lot about Orthodox Judaism. And so that whole idea of not being online and not using the telephone, and then everything that happened with him during that time, it just, my heart goes out to you, because I can't imagine the not knowing part that you experienced. And good for you for taking such a risk to help him and reach out to people that he knew and his dad.
I think that's something most people are going to do. When you're in that situation and
Hmm.
it's your loved one, you're going to do what you know to do.
Yeah. Yeah, no matter what it might cost you, because you love him.
Yeah. He had a very high, when it came to due diligence, he didn't believe something couldn't be done unless he did it himself. So when I was doing something to help him out, he would not accept something couldn't be done without a fight. And I
Hmm.
felt like I had to do that for him. I had to know I'd done everything possible to save his life and to just continue, and after he passed, to continue his legacy.
Yeah.
He knows, if he knows anything, if he exists on any level, he knows that I'm trying.
Yeah. Yeah, you are. You are. And that's the show, everyone. If you've lost a loved one to COVID and would like to share your story on the show, please send me an email. My email address is forthosewelostpodcast@gmail.com. If you like this episode, please share the show. Share it with your friends, share it on your social media, and once you've done that, rate and review this podcast on your favorite listening platform. And then go rate it on Apple Podcast, because that's where most of our new listeners come from. Ratings and reviews are the main way this podcast finds new listeners. So please share the show. Until next time.